The best way to learn a language? Immersion, living where the language is spoken and using it every day. But if that's not in the cards for you this year, you can still learn a language the second best way, and that's with Babbel. Be a better you in 2024 with Babbel, the science-backed language learning app that actually works. Don't pay hundreds of dollars for private tutors or waste hours on apps that don't really help you speak the language. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons are handcrafted by over 200 language experts to help you start speaking a new language in as little as 3 weeks. Babbel's designed by real people for real conversations. Babbel's tips and tools are approachable, accessible, rooted in real-life situations, and delivered with conversation-based teaching so you're ready to practice what you've learned in the real world. For instance, I've been using Babbel's convenient courses to help me learn basic conversational skills in German while I'm getting ready for a little trip I'm planning. It's not a language I'd ever studied before, but I find the lessons really easy and kind of like hand-holding me through learning a completely new language to me. And it's reassuring to know that with the help of Babbel, I'll be able to greet people, order food, and ask for directions without having to consult language apps while I'm in Deutschland. I'm still learning. Studies from Yale, Michigan State University, and others continue to prove Babbel is better. One study found that using Babbel for 15 hours is equivalent to a full semester at college. Babbel has over 16 million subscriptions sold. Plus, all of Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by their 20-day money-back guarantee. Here's a special limited-time deal for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners at babbel.com/vulgar. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/vulgar, spelled BABBEL.com/vulgar. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Ah, the web tour. Those that both created and were created by the threads disentangle from the fringes to feast on the very thing that spawned them.
What's up, Tilly? This is how you deal with weird!
No! Do not harm my children!
Oh, you lost a feather. Can I keep it?
No, you can't force me to!
Do you know what lies within nothing?
Rocket's in trouble, Akasa! Can we turn on the windshield remotely?
No, she could lose her job as an Akasar.
I don't fear Vehar.
No, but you fear me. If you intend to trick me, I will not hesitate to sever the oath bond entirely.
Why didn't you help me? Coward! I don't have a parachute! I don't like free falling!
Counterbalance, a high fantasy audio drama. Season 2, coming 15th of October 2023. Learn more on trilunas.com.
Hello and welcome to Vulgar History of Feminist Women's History comedy podcast. My name is Anne Foster, and before we get going, I just wanted to share something with you. And this is adapted from a statement from Jesse, who does the Jesse's Girl podcast, which I really recommend. He talks about his favorite girl groups, and it's a really fun time. Anyway, he posted this, and it really resonated with me, and it really said what I was hoping to communicate to all of you, which is basically just I want to acknowledge the immense privilege that I have to be able to record this podcast in the midst of global turmoil. The aim of releasing any sort of content right now is to provide some fun and some joy, to be a refuge/escape for anyone listening anywhere in the world, as I know that there are listeners all over the place, including places that are being very profoundly affected right now by global events. And I hope that you know that my thoughts are with all of you and all of your loved ones and everyone you care about. And I know and trust that the Tits Out Brigade are always engaging civically, thinking critically, and leading with empathy. And I'm really grateful for all of you. And I just really wanted to clarify that I hope that this podcast is a nice balm for you, BALM, to just sort of vibe out and have a nice tits out time. With that being said, today's episode is our, I was going to say annual Halloween spooktacular, but I was looking through past episodes and I'm like, oh, I don't think last year the International season was so intense, we didn't even get to do a Halloween special. So this is this year's Halloween special, arriving on November 1st. Except for people on Patreon who get it several days early. But anyway, I was like, okay, I want to do a Halloween super special. And I also wanted to just like bring fun vibes and a nice story. And so the sort of Halloween spooky adjacent things we've talked about before on the podcast are people who are being covered by other wonderful history podcasts right now, are people like Elizabeth Bathory, who, there were these rumors that she was this vampire or whatever. She wasn't. She was a victim of the patriarchy. There's other people, there's witches like Lavoisin. There's the Salem witch trials. Some people have suggested, could there be a vulgar history podcast about that? If you listen to the interview I did with Heather Redmond, where she reveals to all of you that there was one of the victims from Andover during the Salem witch trials scenario was named Anne Foster. So I've always thought, should I do an episode about Anne Foster? But those stories aren't fun in the way that I want this podcast as much as possible to be a good time for you and to share stories that I don't want to tell a story about some woman or person or anyone who was just victimized by powerful men and then executed. I was just okay, who can I talk about? I've done Mary Shelley. I've done Elizabeth Woodville. Who's someone else witchy whose story doesn't end with them being killed? And here's the thing. Okay, it all came together so beautifully. So one of my neighbors has one of those signs up. I have several neighbors who go all out for Halloween decorations, which I love. I love that Halloween decorations have become such a thing in the last, 10 years or so. It's great. And she's one of those signs that says, we are the descendants of the witches that you failed to burn or whatever, which is interesting. And I'll put a link to this article in the show notes to this if you're in the academic era, I want to read this. But a historian named Eleanor Janega posted a blog about how that is her pet peeve, how that phrase, she finds it, and it is, it's very dismissive of the actual people who were killed during the witch trials, who were generally not witches. They were just victims of people who wanted their property or whatever bullshit was going on. Anyway, so it's the descendants, we're the descendants of the people who burned those people, but also those people were mostly hanged. Anyway, but then I was wait a minute. But there is one witch who famously was not burned. And we talked about her in the Mary Queen of Scots season, which is why this is the Halloween special / bonus follow-up to the Mary Queen of Scots season, because we're talking about the one and only Margaret Fleming, who was the older sister of Mary Fleming from the Four Marys. She was present during the birth of Mary Queen of Scots' son, James, baby BJ, Avenge Me, O Lord, etc. And she was there in a witch-like way. And I'm pretty sure that's part of why that's part of why we get into it in this episode, why she was never prosecuted for witchcraft, because James's sort of paternity was always in question. There was a whole thing about was Rizzio the father or whatever. So he couldn't afford to get rid of a person who had been present at his birth because she was a witness to it all. So she was just being a witch her whole life, just we're going to talk about all the stuff she got up to. And I really want to say that this all came to my attention because of a member of the Titsot Brigade, who we do mention in this episode, who is a descendant of Margaret Fleming. And so this listener is, and any other descendants, I guess, of Margaret Fleming are the only people who I think who literally are able to use a mug or wear a sweatshirt that says descendant of the witch you failed to burn, because in fact they are, because Margaret Fleming was, whether there was magic involved or not, she was fully a witch, and she thrived and did amazing. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And my guest is Lucy Hinnie. And we talk about this in the episode too. I'm just really priming you for what you're about to hear. So a couple of things about Lucy. First of all, she's great. Secondly, she's Scottish. And thirdly, she lived for a short amount of time in my city in Saskatoon because she was doing some work at the University of Saskatchewan, the U of S, which is in the city of Saskatoon, which is how I met Lucy, because she was giving a public talk about Mary Queen of Scots. And I'm just well, that's not a thing that happens much here in Saskatoon. That was before I even started the podcast, before this was a dream glint in my eye. And so we've stayed in touch, and I was really excited when I was looking up information about Margaret Fleming that it seemed to coincide with some of the work that Lucy's been doing on manuscripts from that era. Anyway, so it's so great to talk to her. I know you're going to love hearing from her. So please enjoy this talk, this Halloween special / Mary Queen of Scots bonus episode about the witchy ways of Margaret Fleming. Okay, so very excitingly, I'm joined by Lucy Hinnie, who is the first person I've ever had on this podcast who I've met in real life.
Amazing.
Yeah. In fact, I will let the listeners know that right now I'm sitting at a table, an IKEA table that actually I bought from Lucy when she moved out of Saskatoon.
I did. I think my partner Peter actually painted that table as well. We were talking about it today. He's like, I'm sure I painted that in summer. I'm like, yep, you did.
Yeah. It's got like a dark brown stain. Anyway, that's my main table I use. This is where I record everything. So nobody knows, but Lucy, you're
I've been a part of this.
of all this whole time. Exactly. And so you're joining me today. It's actually technically coming out on November 1st, but it's our Halloween special.
Ooh.
And when I was looking for someone to talk about for that, because the last couple of years I've done a Halloween special, and I was like, okay, but I don't want it to be a bummer. And when you're looking at anyone who's like accused of witchcraft, generally the stories end in the same bummer way of their execution, right? I'm just like, but that's not what I want. I'm like, surely, you know that? Actually, my neighbor has one of these signs up. It's like, we're the descendants of the witches you couldn't burn.
Yeah. Yup.
Yeah, actually, Eleanor Janega, who's a historian, she just posted a blog post where she was just being like, it's her pet peeve. She hates that phrase. And she was explaining why it's so disrespectful to the people who were killed. Anyway, but I was like, are there people who... were there witches who weren't burned? And in fact, there's this one. And in fact, then when I was going back through my stuff, I realized that she was brought to my attention first by one of her descendants, who's a woman named Miranda. So thank you, Miranda, for bringing Margaret Fleming to my attention. And Miranda herself says she has bought some of that merch that says the descendant of witches you couldn't burn. And I was like, Miranda, you can wear that. Yes. Other people, no. But if you're verified, Margaret Fleming, like, yes. This was witches I couldn't burn.
Yes, I agree. I think that is legit, definitely.
Yeah, that is the 1% who, if you're descended from, that statement is true, because this is her whole thing. And I talked about her a bit when I was doing an episode about the Four Marys, because she's a sister of one of the Four Marys. But Lucy, can you explain your connection to where you've heard of her, where you've encountered her?
Absolutely. So I did my PhD research on a manuscript from the 16th century called the Bannatyne manuscript. So it dates roughly from 1568. It was compiled by a young man. I mean, I sound old, but he was only 23 when he did it, called George Bannatyne, who was a young Edinburgh burgess from a good family. And the reason he compiled it, or the context in which he compiled it, is that at that point, Edinburgh was hit very badly with the plague. It had sort of rolling incidences of the plague over the 16th and 17th centuries, but this was quite a bad one. So Bannatyne was cast out of the city to quarantine with his family, essentially. We think they probably owned land on the outskirts of the city. So he had 3 months of nothing to do, and he compiled this manuscript, which is like over 400 poems that otherwise may not have been, I would say maybe about a quarter of them are poems that exist elsewhere. A lot of the others, though, are like the only witness to a poem or the only example that we have of a particular one. And what's really cool about his manuscript is that he divides it up into 5 little sections. So he has theology, morality, comedy, love, and fables. And usually with manuscript miscellanies from the late medieval and earlier, it really is miscellaneous. It's like there's medical text, there's like love poems, there's like dirty limericks, there's all this stuff together. But Bannatyne is quite like, these are my chapters, these are my headings, this is where everything's going. And what's interesting about the manuscript is because 1568, he's really keen for people to think that it is finished in 1568. It's written in a couple of places in the manuscript as like other dates are crossed out and 1568 is written there. And he does this cute little poem at the end where he's like, and it was completed in the year 1568. And a lot of critics argue, and I tend to agree, that the reason he's keen on that date is because the poem actually might have started life as a collection of love poems for Mary Queen of Scots and Darnley when they got married. But obviously, as listeners know, that relationship went downhill pretty fast. And all of a sudden, Bannatyne's like, I have this collection of poems that I can't really publicize anymore because they are love poems for a marriage that is irrevocably broken. She might have murdered him and nobody wants to talk about her anymore because essentially we all hate her. So he then kind of pads it out and creates this big collection. So that's one theory that I quite like. So the influence of Mary and people connected with Mary, like Margaret Fleming, on the manuscript is quite interesting because, like, Mary's not really mentioned. The love section is very concerned with like talking essentially about why women are terrible. It has like a game attempt at trying to like level it out. There's like one tiny section that's about false vicious men. There's about under 10 poems in it, and the rest are all just essentially women are terrible. And it's very much connected to that. I think the French call it the querelle de femme, which is like this argument about women, whether they're worth anything, whether they're good or not. So Bannatyne's engaging quite strongly with that. And in the comedy section, there are 3 poems that deal with specific named women. And the specific named women that are the subject of really quite vicious satirical poems are a woman called, it's written Gionnet Reid, but it would be Janet Reid, Crystal Sandals, or Sandalins, it's kind of one of those names that is translated in different ways, and Margaret Fleming, who gets an absolute horrific poem written about her by a poet called Robert Semple, who was virulently anti-Catholic, very anti-Mary. And the poem is called I Have a Little Fleming Berge, which essentially means I have a little Fleming ship. And the poem is ostensibly about this ship, and the ship is like leaky, loads of sailors have been on it, it's not very reliable, it needs a good man to look after it. And it's essentially a really vicious attack on Margaret Fleming for the main reason that she's associated with Mary. And Semple, I mean, he really loves getting stuck into these women. It's largely anti-Catholic, and there's this collection of his work is included in a set of poems called Satirical Poems of the Reformation, which comes out in 1891, edited by a man called Cranston. Of the 48 poems in this collection, 12 of them are by Semple, and he contributes these 3 poems. They're collected in the Bannatyne. Cranston notes that these poems probably would have been circulated around about the time that Mary was in disgrace.
So they would have been circulated in the form of like pamphlets sort of thing?
Yeah, by chapmen and peddlers, so like chapbooks. So like, yeah, we kind of pamphlet-y chapbook things that would have been passed out, similar to what John Knox would have used to get his anti-Mary sentiments around.
What I was going to say was also just this does remind me quite a bit of John Knox's whole vibe. Yeah. The whole like, women are terrible, we hate Mary, Catholics are awful. So just that, do you know of any connection? Or was that like, it sounds like every man in Edinburgh went to John Knox's like incel live podcast recordings.
100%. I think there's a parallel that like I will definitely draw on vulgar history, which is like, I think we look back on the Reformation and we think like everyone suddenly went from being Catholic to being Protestant, and there was definitely a large part of that religious Reformation. What's really interesting about Bannatyne's audience is there were probably still a couple of like fairly well-known families that remained Catholic or had Catholic sympathies, but they would have kept it quieter. I don't know, it's sort of like in the 1930s where, you know, families like the Mitfords and some of the high society families would dabble in like risque things like fascism. They'd be like, oh, well actually the Mitfords went fully in for that. Like some of them did, and then the others went to communism. So I think there was a bit of kind of people dabbling in sort of extremes of both religions. In terms of John Knox, as you well know, like famously hates Mary, and I've just been writing about the two of them actually for my book about the kind of antipathy between the two of them. And I think someone like Semple, Cranston characterizes him, I thought this was a really good quote, as a vigorous supporter of the cause of the Reformation who fought its battles with a willing and unsparing pen. So he's like a John Knox fanboy, I would say. He's agreeing with it. He's like, I'm going to take what you're saying and go further and talk about just how terrible this woman is. And I think that's something that he takes real pleasure in. So he's like absorbing what Knox is saying and thinking, yeah, and you know what, I'm going to make it even better because I'm going to write innuendo-laden poems about it that people are going to think are hilarious. Whether or not they did, I don't know. I don't know what the reception was, but I mean, it's pretty filthy. Like, there's a lot in it. Like, it's the first stanza. It starts. It's about 10 stanzas long, so I won't read the whole thing. But the first stanza reads, and this is in Older Scots, which I have no idea if how I pronounce it is correct, but I will do my best. So it starts with, I have a little Fleming bird of clonk at work, but show is wicht. What pilot tacks my ship in charge, mon hold her cleanly trim and ticht, so that her hatches be handled richt, with steerboard, starboard, loof and lee. Show will sail all the winter nicht, and never tack a talyavai. So what that means is, I have a little ship. She's made of riveted work, but she's strong. What helmsman takes control of the ship, he needs to hold her cleanly, trim and tight, and see that he handles her hatches right. On her starboard, larboard, love and lee, and she will sail all the winter night, never pitching over. So it's about men handling a ship properly. And then in like stanza 3, it goes fully like, you can tell a man wrote this. It's like, you can see, to calce her oft can do none ill, and talon where the flood mark flows. But gif she lecks get men of skill to stop her holes like in the house. For fault of hemp tack hairy tows with stone ballast with uten udder. In monless necks it is now moose, except in stout man steer her ruder. And this is like full innuendo. To cock her often can do no harm. Mark with tallow where the flood mark flows. But if she leaks, get men of skill to stop her holes leaking, flap in the house. If there is a defect of hemp, take hairy tows with stone ballast. Penis imagery. Without other, in a moonless night, it is no sport to steer her rudder unless you are a stout man. So there's a lot in this poem about plugging up holes. It's like, it's not subtle. It's all about this. Often at this point, women are seen as being like inconstant or unreliable. And it's actually a professor from U of S, David Parkinson, who I was working with when I was in Saskatoon. He's written about this poem and he's like, the unreliable, leaky vessel of women. And as far as we know, Margaret Fleming, her crime in Robert Semple's eyes was like being in Mary's circle. Like that was it. It's just 3 women who happened to be near her.
Which is really interesting. Well, and also the fact, like, this is who he chose. Like, he didn't choose one of the 4 Marys, maybe because their husbands were more influential or something. But he just chose this random woman. He didn't choose Mary herself. He's just kind of like, okay, I've got this hilarious idea for a poem about women as a ship. And he just like randomly chose a name, it seems like.
Yeah, he's just like, who's in that social strata that I can poke fun at. And it's just, I mean, I couldn't believe it the first time I read it. I was like, are you kidding me? I thought Margaret Fleming must not be a real person. And then I looked up and I'm like, oh no, this is real. And the fact that Bannatyne's including it, he's an interesting editor because he's not, even though I would say the collection is quite, it's adapted to not be a pro-Mary collection, because that would be like career death at that point. Would be like, hey, here's my collection of poems that are really all about how great Mary is. But it's not like overtly anti-Catholic. It's not like a John Knox approved Richard and Judy book club thing. Richard and Judy are like 2 morning TV presenters in the UK, and they like stamp books. It's like the Oprah book club. So it's not the John Knox book club, but these are included as like just funny poems, like these 3 really vicious attacks on these specific women. And I'm like, it wouldn't be like Bannatyne to take a massive risk, so they must be widely circulated funny poems that people like. So it's very strange.
Yeah. So I've put together some information about the actual Margaret Fleming herself, which
I would love to know more about her. I'm so psyched about this.
Here's the thing. The most I first heard about her from Miranda, who is this descendant of her.
That's incredible.
But then, and I was like, what? Like, she told me some details that we're going to get into. And then I was like, I want to learn more about her. And I have a couple books. I'll say what my sources are. There's the 2 books I got, they're academic books, and there's like 1 sentence in each one about her. But I'll just cite them just because. So Queen Mary, because it's a great title, Queen Mary's Women, Female Relatives, Servants, Friends, and Enemies of Mary Queen of Scots by Rosalind K. Marshall.
Oh, Rosalind Marshall's great.
Oh, yeah. It's a great book about various people. And then there's a book called The Scottish Witch Hunt in Context, edited by Julian Goodare.
Okay.
So 2 books that I got a bit of information from, but I got honestly most of my information from both Wikipedia and a site called Wikitree, which is like for genealogists. Like the people out there doing the work are like people researching their own family trees.
That's so, genealogists are incredible. I work for Wiki now, which is like my non-academic job is that I work for Wiki, and often we work with like local history groups and genealogy groups. They're incredible. The amount of information they have is unreal.
Yeah, I was talking last week, the listeners will have heard it last week, I think, with John Guy and Julia Fox, who just wrote a new biography of Anne Boleyn.
Oh, incredible.
And they were saying, in this book, which is really good, even if you are like, oh, I know the story of Anne Boleyn, it's like, no, you don't. Because they got new sources that no one has ever written about before. And a lot of it was from these local genealogy groups, like from local historical societies. Like they went and they found these letters and journals that no one's ever found before. But these groups, like these people...
They do it.
From my impression is just the UK is just full of these like little small towns where people have these like little gems of information and they put it all together.
Yeah.
So here's what we know about Margaret Fleming, and her last name is Fleming. She was the older sister of Mary Fleming from the Four Marys. She's quite a bit older. She's 14 years older than Mary Fleming. I don't know if you have the Google document in front of you, Lucy, but I'm gonna try and say some Scottish place names. And you can correct me.
Excellent.
So she was born probably around 1528, around 14 years before Mary Fleming and Mary Queen of Scots. She was born in Boghall Castle, Biggar, Lanarkshire, Scotland.
Yeah, all good. In fact, there's a bigger Saskatchewan as well, I believe. Yeah.
There is, and the tagline of it is something like, New York City is big, but we're bigger.
I love that. That's amazing.
Biggar, Saskatchewan. Okay, so her mother was Janet Stewart, and I'm going to pause. Janet Stewart, who was the woman who was the governess of Mary Queen of Scots, and then she went over and had the illegitimate child with the French king.
I think that is correct, yeah.
Yeah. So she's like quite a cool, interesting person herself. And so Janet Stewart was a daughter of James IV of Scotland. So all of the Scottish Jameses up to James the 1st/6th had so many illegitimate children.
Like ludicrous numbers. Ludicrous.
Like every other person in Scotland, from what I can tell from reading, had the surname Stewart and was the illegitimate child of a king whose name was James. So, but this gives this family, and this gives Janet, because the Scottish thing, different from other countries, was he would recognize these illegitimate children and they would get titles and things. So this was like a noble family because she was the illegitimate.
Yeah, it was way less of a, like, Game of Thrones, I think, has given us this idea that, like, illegitimates were like the spawn of the dead, but like honestly, like one of Mary Queen of Scots' closest kind of advisors was an illegitimate brother, like a half brother.
Yeah. No, they were all, her brother, I don't know how much of the podcast you've heard, but James Stewart, who we call on my podcast, Hollywood icon, Jimmy Stewart.
Excellent.
To differentiate him from the 75 other men called James Stewart in that story.
It's so frustrating. Like, honestly, any family tree in Scotland, you're like, oh, good, another John. Oh, good, another James. Oh, a Robert. Wonderful.
Yeah. And then all the women are called Janet.
Yes.
For me, researching this, like the amount of notes I have. Anyway, so that's why I gave everybody a nickname. But Janet Stewart, she was great. So she went over with Mary Queen of Scots. She was the governess. She had an affair with the king. That got found out. She was kicked back to Scotland. Anyway, so Margaret, she also had legitimate children, Janet Stewart. Her husband was Malcolm Fleming, the third Lord Fleming. And so Margaret, we'll go through the saga. So Margaret Fleming. So in 1545, she married her first husband. So this would be, she was like just a bit less than 20. So it's one of those arranged young people, family alliance type marriages. She married her first husband, Robert Graham, the Master of Montrose. And then he died in the Battle of Pinkie Cleugh.
Which is a real thing, the Battle of Pinkie. That always cracked me up.
Thank you, because it always cracks me up, and it's talked about very seriously because a lot of people died. Can you remind everybody which battle that was?
Oh, the Battle of Pinkie. You know, Anne, you might be better placed on this than I am. It was very important in Mary Queen of Scots' story, isn't
Marie
it?
de Guise War, I think.
Yeah. And it kind of, I think it sort of sits at the start of when people are getting really unsettled about the prospect of Mary Queen of Scots. It's sort of quite portentous in that way. And it's called the Battle of Pinkie, which just always cracks me up.
This was the last pitched battle between this. I'm looking at Wikipedia. I love that you work for them because like I respect them and I use them as a source and I have no problem with it. So anyway, it's the last pitched battle between Scotland and England. It was part of the rough wooing.
That's it, the rough wooing, which is when Henry VIII is trying to
get baby Mary, Queen of Scots, married to his son. Yeah.
And it's interesting because I now live in York in England, and in the rough wooing, Henry VIII, he decimates like lots of land throughout the country, but York remains relatively untouched because Henry is like, oh, I can go there on holiday. I quite like that. So like King's Manor in York is intact because Henry's like, oh yeah, I'll use it as a holiday home. Which I just find that, I'm like, imagine having that BDE where you're just like, yeah, I'll just keep it as a holiday home. But a lot of history from that time in Scotland is lost in the rough wooing because cathedrals and so on are ransacked or damaged beyond repair because of Henry's tactics. And yeah, Battle of Pinkie sits in the heart of that at this point where Henry's really aggressively throwing his power around and trying to secure that match, which would solve problems for him, but...
Oh yeah, no, for sure. I was just going to say, I think the Battle of Pinkie, I know I came across a lot of backstories of a lot of the people I talked about. I think a lot of people's dads died in the battle. Like I think the four Marys, some of their fathers died in this battle. So it says here that this was a catastrophic defeat for Scotland where it became known as Black Saturday.
And it's interesting because in 1513 there's the Battle of Flodden, which is similar. In fact, I think one of the Jameses dies at that battle, where it essentially wipes out a whole generation of nobility. So they've kind of just sort of generationally recovered from that. And then the Battle of Pinkie happens and it's sort of like history repeating itself. In terms of, like you say, loss of fathers and husbands and men in their lives.
Yeah. So Margaret's father, Janet's husband, dies in this battle, which is like a lot. I don't know. It reminds me of like World War I or something where it's just like a generation of young men just kind of all die.
Yeah.
And then, so that is why Janet is single and ready to mingle with the King of France 1 year later. Anyway, so Margaret Fleming, 14 years older than Mary Fleming. So when she's getting married at around the same time that Mary Queen of Scots is being born. So it's like kind of a generation earlier, but not quite a generation. Anyway, so she got married and then he died 2 years later in the Battle of Pinkie. Margaret's father also died in the Battle of Pinkie. Her brother-in-law died. Like every man in Scotland died, basically. But she did give birth to a son before, I think he died and then she gave birth. So it's a bit of a Margaret Beaufort situation in the sense of like you're a teen widow giving birth to the baby of your dead husband. So she had numerous children. Honestly, none of them matter, except for that one of them is Miranda's ancestor. So they met her in that way. In terms of our story and Halloween and the witchiness of it all, she had various children. Good. So then she next married Thomas Erskine. Is that still a popular last name in Scotland?
Erskine, I don't know many, but we have the Erskine Bridge is one of the main ways you can cross over into Edinburgh from Perthshire. So there's Erskine Bridge and there's a place called Erskine. No, sorry, the Erskine Bridge. That's absolute nonsense. The Erskine Bridge is near Glasgow and there's a River Erskine as well. So it's around. It's not the most popular. I mean, you'd still get Stuarts and Grahams, but Erskine, not so much.
So her second husband was Thomas Erskine. They were married, let me see. So she's married 1545, 2 years later. So she married 2 years after the death of her first husband. Man. She married Thomas Erskine in Erskine. Thomas Erskine of Erskine, Midlothian. Her dowry was paid by Marie de Guise. Wow. So I think because of the Fleming connection to the Stuarts would be my guess. Because, so, oh God, okay, all the King James. So Marie de Guise was married to James the Fifth.
Yep.
Fifth.
Yeah, I think so.
So if Janet Stuart was the daughter of James the Fourth, anyway, they're related. They're through the Stuarts. They're related.
It's like V incesty. Well, not incesty, but it's like incestuous at this point. Like everyone's related in some way.
Everyone's related. I think Marie de Guise, like us, I think she'd just be like, God damn, another Stuart, illegitimate. Okay, I'll pay the dowry, whatever. Who is this? Yeah. I don't know. Anyway, but that just shows the family's connection, which is also what's interesting about her having this poem making fun of her. So maybe that's part of why she was chosen. She was connected to Mary, but she also had the Stuart lineage. So it's a way to make fun of Mary without making fun of Mary, like, because she had the Stuart.
Yeah.
Anyway, so then she married Thomas Erskine, and then I'm not sure what happened.
Mm.
Well, he died, clearly, because then she married John Stewart.
Another one.
Brackets no relation, brackets some relation.
Yeah.
The 4th Earl of Atholl. That's a word. How do you say that?
Atholl. Yeah.
Atholl? Okay, because this is her surname she becomes best known as.
Yeah.
So they were married. This was 1557. So she's born, God, okay.
So she's
like 29.
Wow.
She's like 29 on her third husband.
That is incredible.
Yeah. And I don't know, kind of par for the course, I would think, for Scottish women, just in terms of how many battles all the men are doing. Okay, let me just see. So then we skip ahead. So 1557, she's married. So he's the Earl of Atholl, which makes her the Countess?
Countess, yeah.
Yeah, the Countess of Atholl. So this one sticks. She doesn't marry again. So now the years go by. So about 10 years later, James, Mary Queen of Scots' son, James, is born.
Excellent. Yeah.
And this is where Margaret Fleming comes on the scene in a big way. Okay, so this is where, so you wrote a note here. So Richard Bannatyne, a secretary of John Knox, recorded a story about her. And I was like, oh, the Bannatyne manuscript. But this is not the Bannatyne manuscript.
It's not the same one. So I went and looked at this. And again, everyone's got the same bloody names. But I had to look. It's mostly regarded that he's a relation of George Bannatyne, but it's not 100% clear what that relationship is. I think it's likely that they're cousins. They're definitely not brothers from what I can tell. So the Bannatynes they're a high-flying family at this point. They tend to be like lawyers, secretaries, educated men. So they definitely would have been related in some way, I think, but it's not a close familial relationship in the sense of it's not a brother or father-son situation. As far as I can tell, I need to go and double-check that because he writes, and you're quite right, he writes the Bannatyne memorials. So it could be his father, but I would need to go and double check that. It's certainly not his brother, and it's certainly not George Bannatyne himself. There's a little bit of distance there, but the family is in common.
What's hilarious about that is that when I was reading this stuff about Margaret Fleming, I'm like, okay, I'm going to do this episode. I came across the name Bannatyne. I said, Bannatyne, he wrote some stuff. I'm like, oh, Lucy. This must be the thing that she studied, and it's not even, but...
Yeah, I'm looking at the Clan Bannatyne page because apparently they're a clan, which I find really funny. I don't know much about the kind of clan terminology. So George Bannatyne is listed. He's 1545 to 1608, and Richard Bannatyne dies in 1605. So that makes me think that it's probably not his dad, unless his dad lived to a good old age. There will definitely be an in-depth genealogy of this somewhere. I'm just having another quick look at the National Archives as well. You know, those things where you're like, I really should know more about this than I actually do. And knowing who Bannatyne's relationships are, because one of the things I've been doing lately, which is a cute little, it's not cute actually, some of the stuff in it's quite horrifying, is looking at the links between the Bannatyne manuscript and essentially colonial history and who held the manuscript, because it's one of the reasons that it stands out so much is because it didn't get lost. We always knew where it was. We always knew who had it, and it ended up in the Advocates Library in the 18th century. And almost everyone who held the manuscript ends up being connected to the Bank of Scotland in its early days, or the Baronets of Nova Scotia, which is quite interesting in the sense that this is a group of people, a group of links that tie in with most of Scotland's overseas interests that then end up being awful endeavours that cost a lot of human lives. But there's this coterie of people back in Scotland just passing around this manuscript and sort of looking at it saying, aren't these jolly stories? And it's it's a strange thing to think about, thinking about where it physically was. So in short, Richard, a relation of some kind. Accounts vary on which. Certainly for me, it seems likely that they were cousins. It could have been his father, but the date of death makes me think it might not have been as simple as that. the one person who has written extensively on the memorial book of Bannatyne is an academic called Theo van Heinsbergen, who was my master's supervisor. He did a really interesting book, a really interesting study of a lot of the people we're talking about today and the Bannatyne, called the prosoprographical context of the Bannatyne manuscript, which looks at both the manuscript and the memorials. So I'm just having a wee look here. It is important to note, though, that George Bannatyne's mother gave birth to 22 other children. George Bannatyne was one of 23.
Jesus.
Which is absolutely wild. So, I mean, it could be that he was his brother, but just by a far distance. I'm just having a quick scan of some of the other biographical information here.
22. That's like...
I mean, she must have just been consistently pregnant.
The Duggar.
Like, oh my gosh, awful. And Bannatyne's uncle and his cousin both died at the Battle of Pinkie. I'm just looking to see if Theo mentions Richard at all, because it's just not a name that comes up that frequently. I'm just going to have a quick check because I don't want to be quoted as saying it's absolutely definitely not his father or brother, and then it turns out it's definitely not his father, because his father's name is, it's going to be John or James, isn't it? Like, there's no other names in Scotland at this point in history.
Dev, that's a challenge to have 22 children in Scotland in this era. How do you think of 22 different names? There aren't 22 different names.
Honestly, it must have just been like a heck of a lot of James, like James 1, James 2, James 3, James 4. Yeah. But I believe his father was also a James. I'm just having a look to see George's mother. Yeah, it's interesting. So I would hazard, if I had to put money on it without going deep into the genealogical annals, I would guess that it is at closest a younger sibling, but I think it is much more likely that it's a cousin. George's father, James, was part of the Bannatyne dynasty, and as we know from records from the Battle of Pinkie, there were other Bannatynes in that generation. So it would surprise me if they'd never met one another. I think they would be familiar. I think there would be family connections, but I don't think they would necessarily be siblings. But it's interesting because the manuscript is so well known that Bannatyne is this connection to Mary as well, Mary and to Margaret. Yeah, there's just so many people and so many connections at this point that it becomes like a very confusing Agatha Christie.
It really does. Can I tell you, just in terms of everyone being called James? So I'm going to be later today doing this YouTube live discussion of the Mary Queen of Scots movie, the Saoirse Ronan one from 2018. Did you see that?
Yeah, I have just literally finished a chapter about James VI and queerness, in which I talk about that film quite a lot, because there's quite a lot of interesting stuff happening there with sexuality and gender.
Do you remember the part of the movie where Mary is pregnant and she's sort of making amends with her brother, Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart?
Yes.
And whose name is James. And so she's like, I'm going to call my son James. And then he starts crying. He's like, oh my God, you're naming your son James after me. This is such a piece. It's like, James, this is the only name.
This is the only name.
What other name is there? He's crying in the movie. He's crying at the tribute that she's calling her son James. And it's like, there's not another option. That's the only name there is, James.
You're like, that's it. There are only Jameses. Only Jameses. Only James in this country. James, and at best you might get an Alexander, but it's unlikely. It's probably going to be a James.
It was a highlight of the movie to me.
I love that. I love that. That's hilarious.
Okay, so here we've got this other Bannatyne. A relation to your, I'm going to call him your Bannatyne.
My Bannatyne, George.
There's the Bannatyne. What's it called? The Bannatyne manuscript is what you're.
Yeah, that's what people generally refer to it as. Yeah.
But then this other Bannatyne, Richard Bannatyne, the secretary of John Knox, had his own thing. There was, what was it called? The Memorials.
Yeah, so he's writing, so George Bannatyne writes, I think it's a memorial book where he accounts for a lot of the people around him and who exist in that era, because Bannatyne never does another literary endeavour. The next thing he does is this memorial book of all the people he's related to, and it's kind of like a who's who. But it seems that Richard Bannatyne is secretary of John Knox, also did some history writing, and I don't know if it's called the Memorial or not. I'm just clicking into find out what it's called, but he is also doing kind of recounting. Yeah, he does memorials of transactions in Scotland from 1569 to 1573. And according to the Dictionary of National Biography, it has been inferred that he was of the same family with George Bannatyne, but there's nothing concrete known about him. So I wonder if, I don't know, my headcanon, I've decided, is that he's like the extremist cousin who like people are like, yeah, we don't really talk to Richard so much, but he's around. He sometimes comes for Christmas, but he sometimes goes on his weird rants. So we're just going to not associate with him that frequently. So that's my canon and I'm sticking to it.
Well, and this is who we know. So Richard Bannatyne, a secretary of John Knox. So you just think, like a big Joe Rogan fanboy, gross, terrible person. So he, in his writing, recorded a story. And this is like the main thing anyone knows about Margaret Fleming. But I don't know. Sources. Who's right? Who's wrong? This is a great story. And I'm going to take it that it's true. And now we're just going to take a break for a word from our sponsors.
As a podcast network, our first priority has always been audio and the stories we're able to share with you. But at Realm, we also sell some pretty cool merch, and organizing that was made both possible and easy with Shopify. When you think about successful businesses like Aloe or Allbirds or Skims, an often overlooked secret is the business behind the business that makes selling and, for shoppers, buying simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. That's because nobody does selling better than Shopify. It's the home of the #1 checkout on the planet. And the not-so-secret secret that's definitely worth talking about is that Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%. That's more happy customers and way more sales going. If you're hoping to grow your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling, on the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between. Businesses that sell more, sell on Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout we use with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/realm, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/realm to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/realm.
Hello, my name is Alison Larkin, and I'm a writer, comedian, and narrator and host of the Jane Austen podcast. This podcast brings Jane Austen's stories to the 21st century, along with commentary from me and conversations with fascinating people who all share a love of Jane Austen. And of course, we had to start with none other than Pride and Prejudice. So join me as we embark on a journey through some of the most wonderful stories I know. The Jane Austen podcast with Alison Larkin is available wherever you listen to podcasts.
People often look at me with confusion when I ask them what their only one in the room story is. They think it has to be like mine, where I went to a 600-person event and discovered that I was the only Black person there. I know. Horrifying, right? Hi, I'm Laura Cathcart-Robbins, and I am the host and creator of the podcast Only One in the Room. Every week, my co-host Scott Slaughter and I invite you to join us for an hour and lose yourself in someone's only one story. This podcast is for anyone who's ever felt alone in a room full of people, which is to say that this podcast is for everyone.
I'm Brennan Storr.
I'm Paul Bestall.
We're the Ghost Story Guys.
And every 2 weeks, we explore first-person stories of encounters with the paranormal from all around the world.
Then we have some fun reacting to those stories. We like to say our goal is to scare the hell out of you, then make you laugh.
Belief in the paranormal is not required. All you need is a love of great storytelling and curiosity about the world around you.
Come find the Ghost Story Guys on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else fine podcasts live, or at ghoststoryguys.com.
And we're back. Based on what else we know, I think it is true. So he recorded a story that when Mary, Queen of Scots was in childbirth, Margaret Fleming was one of the people tending to her. And so I talked about this in the Four Marys episode. Like Mary, Queen of Scots famously had the Four Marys, but then the Four Marys all had sisters, and their sisters were kind of like the outer circle. Like they were also involved. Yeah. And their sisters were all called Margaret.
The Four Margarets. I love that.
the four Margarets are the four older sisters. Anyway, so Margaret Fleming was apparently there on the scene when James was born, and she was called upon to magically transfer Mary's labor pains to someone else. Ironically, to Margaret Beaton, who I assume is the older sister of Mary Beaton. So, and this is a thing. This is like, I heard from, I don't have the message in front of me right now, but another listener who, when I was talking about this briefly in a previous episode, she was saying like, yeah, this is like midwifery, the connection between like midwives and sort of like magic and whatever. It's like, this is a thing. So anyway, she was brought upon to transfer the labor pains to someone else. Guess what? Didn't work. But
she tried. You would be so bummed out. You'd be like, oh no.
And the other woman was like, no, really, you could do it. But so at this point, she was clearly known to be a person who had some magic powers. One might say a witch. So Bannatyne was, okay, Richard Bannatyne was an enemy and political opponent of Margaret Fleming's husband. He described her husband as an idolater and depender on witches. So, you know, he had his own reasons for wanting to share the fact that she maybe was a witch. But I'm going to be honest, she was a witch. So,
yeah, she 100% was. Yeah.
No, exactly. So she was called upon to, in this situation. And this is where, like, we're going to talk about this in a minute, but she lived long decades and decades. And when James I Sussex became king and he was going crazy persecuting witches, he never went after her. And it's because she was present at his birth. He couldn't call into question his legitimacy. So he could never go after her. But I love that she was at his birth as a witch.
Oh, yeah. And James is, I mean, man, yeah.
His whole deal was just like going after witches, but he could never go after her. And this is why she's the witch who they couldn't burn.
They got away. The one they really couldn't burn.
Yeah, not just because she was her pedigree, like her relation to the family, but she was present at his birth. Like he could never go after her because he needed those witnesses.
Yeah.
So he's born. 3 years later, so God, everything happened so quickly for Mary Queen of Scots.
So flippin' quick, isn't it?
So at this point, Darnley's been blown up. She's potentially on the run. Anyway, so actually, can I tell you one more thing that I enjoyed in the Mary Queen of Scots movie? So do you know, I assume you know, the famous drawing of the murder of Darnley that's like a one-panel graphic novel of everything happening all at once that like William Cecil's person had draw?
Yes.
Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And there's the part of that in the upper corner, it's baby James, and he's saying, "Avenge my cause, oh Lord." And it's hilarious because he's like a baby.
I love a baby in a kind of late medieval, early modern painting. Just wonderful. They always look so strangely old and wise.
And the fact that he's saying, "Avenge my cause, oh Lord." In the movie, in the Saoirse Ronan movie, the baby is shown screaming a couple times. And I'm just like, what he's trying to say, this baby is...
Subtitle, "Avenge me." Avenge my cause.
Another highlight to me in that movie. Okay, so 1570, all the shit's happened with Mary Queen of Scots, basically. So there's a guy called, actually, can I ask you, do you know very many people with the surname Douglas?
Yes, Douglas is still a pretty common surname, I would say. Yeah. And a place name as well.
Yeah, they're all over this story. It's just like everybody has the surname Douglas. And what I find entertaining is that their battle cry is, "A Douglas, a Douglas."
I have a friend called Douglas. I don't know if he knows this. I'll have to tell him. A Douglas. A Douglas.
You need to tell him. So it's when they went to like the murder of Rizzio, they were all like, "A Douglas." It's like, oh my God, who is doing this? Oh, the Douglases.
Who could possibly be doing it?
And then the part where Darnley is stabbed outside of his exploded house. He's like, "Don't do this to me, my kinsman." It's like, oh, how did they know it was a kinsman? Were they yelling, "A Douglas, a Douglas" in the dark? They can't not yell this constantly.
Subterfuge is just not a Douglas thing.
No, but they have their battle cry and they cry it constantly.
Oh, I love that.
Okay, so this is complex, but this is the story, so I'll tell you. So, October 1570, Mr. Archibald Douglas, and I have encountered people in the story called Archibald Douglas. There was Archibald Douglas was one of Margaret Tudor's husbands. This is not him. This is a different guy. It might be a person who I nicknamed on my show, A. Douglas. So he obtained a jewel that had been made for Mary Queen of Scots as propaganda for the Scottish succession to the English throne. He showed it to the English diplomat Thomas Randolph, who I call Randy Randolph, because he was so horny for the four Marys, and he wrote much about them, about how much he was attracted to them. Randy Randolph, he wanted to marry one, and then he couldn't, and then he's all like, well, I didn't want to marry you anyway. He's just like, he's also in the Saoirse Ronan movie. I'm like, oh my God, Randy's in the movie? I was excited. Anyway, so he gave it to Randy. Randy's just lingering around Scotland. So Randy sent the jewel to London to be like, oh my God, look at this treason jewel. And I love how much the Mary Queen of Scots story has like symbolism of like embroideries and things where it's just like these symbols. So it's like if you go to a court of law to be like, well, this means this and this means this, it's like, does it?
Well, she was so like one of the things that always fascinates me about her is that she used soft arts, inverted commas, of like embroidery and poetry, and they became simultaneously her kind of strength and her downfall. It's very interesting. It was something that was very like looked down upon, but was also a source of kind of her femininity as well as her queenship. And I find that really interesting. So like, yeah, treasonous jewel, a symbolism. This definitely means this. It's so interesting.
The whole thing is so interesting. And then, because now it's like what the intent of it was, what people took it as, and then what we now today interpret it as. Like there's a lot falls through the cracks of like, what did this actually mean?
Yeah, what does it actually stand for? What does it mean?
So this jewel was said to be shaped like an antler. And a heart-horn hearse.
Heart-horn hearse.
Heart-horn hearse. So a heart shape, anyway, it's shaped like antlers. And this jewel, and I'm just like, how big is this jewel? How can a jewel show all these things? So this jewel shows Mary enthroned with two fighting lions with the inscription, fall what may, fall the lion shall be lord of all. With a motif of intertwined roses and thistles.
Interesting. So is James the lion? Or I don't know, because there's two lions. Oh, that's interesting.
Mary enthroned. Listen, so Mary on a throne with two fighting lions. So is it saying that the lions are fighting? I don't know. Like this is, even to me, I'm just like, oh, that's treason adjacent jewelry. Like I don't know a lot about symbolism, but this is like, okay. I would be concerned.
Mild treason.
I would be concerned. So Randy was horrified by the implications of this treason jewel, which he said was a token to be sent to Mary. And the jewel was conjectured to have been commissioned by the Witch of Atholl, which is Margaret Fleming and her daughters. So the Witches of Atholl.
Interesting.
So the jewel is apparently, so I'm just like, oh, so it's a treason jewel, but also casts an evil magic spell? Okay.
Interesting. A cursed jewel of treason.
So, and it's by the Witches of Atholl, and this is in that book I mentioned that was like the history of the Scottish witch hunts or whatever. Like the Witch of Atholl is a thing that comes up. It's just like Margaret Fleming was AKA the Witch of Atholl. Everyone's just like, she just is. That's the witch. She's Margaret Fleming. Here's what's up. Like, she's a witch, taken for granted. So this jewel did exist. The clerk of the Privy Council, Alexander Hay, mentioned the jewel in a letter to the Scottish regent after speaking with Randy about it. But again, it's just like Randy was like, I saw this jewel. It's like, does this jewel exist, Randy? Or did you just make it up?
Did you just describe something that is in fact not real?
Yeah. So he said that Margaret Fleming sent it to Mary, but it fell into Elizabeth's hands. It was no bigger than the palm of a hand and in the shape of a horse of a heart horn and well decked with gold and enameled. According to Hay, the design included the royal arms of Scotland and an image of Mary in royal robes with a lion fighting a leopard and the motto. Anyway, Hay wrote that this matter was kept dainty, which I think means secret, but it was known. Elizabeth was not pleased. Richard Bannatyne also described this jewel. I feel like something happened, but I also feel like Randy was prone to hyperbole. So to make a jewel with literally Mary Queen of Scots' image on it, saying like she will take over the country, is not anyone's style in this period. It's more like, oh, this is a picture of Aesop's fable.
And it's interesting because one of the big things at Holyrood Palace that they still have in the collection is the Darnley jewel or the Lennox jewel, which was given to Mary, I think, before their marriage. It was commissioned much earlier, but it was given to to Mary. It was held by her prior to their wedding, I believe. It's interesting that they would pick something like a jewel knowing that was something that was associated with Mary. I don't know. It's very strange.
And I don't.
It's like they took a bit of it and made it wrong.
I don't know. Like, I'm not going to get into this right now, but it reminds me a little bit of the casket letters, where it's just like, oh yeah, I saw these letters and they totally said this and this and this. And then someone's like, can you show us the letters? And they're like, I'll show you a copy of the letters with no dates on them. Where it's like, everyone just really wants evidence that Mary is scheming, but like, she was too, anyway, I was going to say Mary Queen of Scots was too good to do something like this, but Margaret Fleming, chaos, she would have done it. She doesn't care. She made a witch jewel. Like,
she could do that. I believe it.
Yeah, exactly. What was the year that you said that your Bannatyne manuscript, when was that?
1568.
Yeah. So this is after that. So she's just like, you're going to write this like sexy poem about me, put it on pamphlets? Fine. Here's what I'm going to do. Trees and jewel.
Trees and jewel. Boom.
Yeah. Okay. So Margaret's daughter, Jean, because everyone's called Jean/Janet. She married Duncan Campbell of Glenorchy.
Mm-hmm.
And then Margaret's husband, the Earl of Atholl, died at Kincardine Castle.
Kincardine. But to be fair, that's a weird way of saying something that does look like Kincardine. But yeah, Kincardine.
Kincardine Castle near Auchterarder.
Yeah, nice. Auchterarder. Yeah, 10 out of 10. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. So Margaret's husband died soon after attending a banquet at Stirling Castle. Margaret Fleming was also unwell. So a rumor started that they had been poisoned at the request of various people. So Annabel Murray is the Countess of Mar, and she was the sister-in-law of Margaret Fleming. Or potentially they were poisoned by Regent Morton, who we call, for various reasons, Councilman Jeremy Jam from Parks and Recreation.
They got jammed.
So basically, Margaret got sick. Her husband died. It seems like they were poisoned. And here's what I'm going to say. A lot of people were poisoning a lot of people at this time. They probably were poisoned.
Mm-hmm.
Probably. So one of her sister-in-laws wrote... Let's see. So I don't know. It sounds like Margaret Fleming herself was maybe accusing Annabel Murray of having poisoned her. Her sister-in-law wrote to Annabel being like, oh, that's not true. We know that you didn't really poison her. Margaret Fleming also appeared in person before the Privy Council to petition for her son's rights. Regarding what? I'm not sure.
Interesting.
But her life is, not dull.
Yeah. She's advocating for her family. That's incredible.
And she's maybe being poisoned by Councilman Jeremy Jam.
Yeah.
So the Earl's will mentions their tapestries. We did a whole episode about Bess of Hardwick, so I'm like all in on tapestries of this era.
Excellent.
She had 186 stones weight of new wool. I don't know what that means exactly. In the wardrobe of Balvenie Castle.
Balvenie, listeners may know it from the whiskey. It's up in the northeast of Scotland, very near where I grew up. It's now basically adjacent to the grounds of Glenfiddich Distillery. So it's quite rural. And at that time, you're talking about maybe a 3-hour drive from Edinburgh now. So yeah, quite far north. And yeah, that's really interesting. I didn't know she had a connection to Balvenie at all. It's still standing, it's ruins, but it is still there.
And I think if you're going to be the Witch of Atholl, you want to be in a rural, remote area.
Yeah.
You want to be not in city center.
It's interesting, and this is total conjecture on my part, like finding out about her links to like Dunkeld and Blair. Macbeth is going to come out in the next 50 years or so, and the witches there are Dunkeld and Burnham, or Burnham would just come to Dunsinane. Like, there's connections to that part of the world as well. I wonder if Shakespeare had that in mind when he was thinking of those witches, or if he was going for more historical records about Macbeth himself. But it seems like I don't know, there's a resonance there with James VI and First's preoccupations with it as well.
Well, that's so interesting. And also, then I imagine that Shakespeare trolling him a little bit to be like, I'm going to make the witches live in this place where your aunt, a witch, lives today.
LOL. Like, boom.
And you can't do anything about it.
You cannot do a thing. You're a patron of the arts.
James could never do anything. And this is where, like, I love that Margaret Fleming was so untouchable. Entirely because she was present at his birth. And there was the whole thing about, like, was the father actually Rizzio, right? So he had to always be... Anyway, I love this. So the other thing, so she had this home in Belvenny Castle. It says like that was her main home. That's where she kept her 186 stones weight of new wool.
Wow.
What's she doing with it? I don't know. Wool is not heavy. Like,
no, that's a lot of wool. Belvenny's not big. That must have been like a fair amount.
What are you doing with all that wool? Magic things.
Magic.
Their other homes are at Dunkeld and Blair. So, which are also, you were saying, sort of far away from Edinburgh, like sort of rural areas.
Yeah, so there's this road that goes from Edinburgh, Glasgow. So once you go north to Perth, which is about an hour north of both places, then there's this road called the A9, which takes you all the way up to Inverness. And it's got a lot of kind of historical sites on it, and Blair Atholl and Dunkeld and places like that are all on it. So it would have been one of the main routes up north as well. So it makes sense that she would maybe have Dunkeld rather as a halfway house and then head on up to Balvenie. It's a way I often drove home. So yeah, it's a handy route.
You're following. You didn't know in the footsteps of
I
this
didn't know.
famous witch.
I didn't know. If only I had known, I would have taken power from it.
Exactly. Okay, 1583. She's in credit trouble, owing Edinburgh tailor John Young money. So I wonder, I'm going to guess this has to do with the wool.
Yeah. I'm going to take a stab and say the ridiculous amount of wool might have cost her a bit of money. Yeah. I would back you on that.
Yeah. So she was in credit trouble. Her goods, widows, terse, and income were assigned to David Lindsay. I wanted to mention in the story of Mary Queen of Scots, there is a person called Lindsay. He appeared a few times and it was just exciting because his name wasn't James. His name was Lindsay. So and we remember Lindsay because he's married to Euphemia.
Lindsay and Euphemia.
Yeah, so this is not Lindsay from Lindsay and Euphemia. This is a different Lindsay, just so everybody knows.
Excellent.
But anyway, this Lindsay, like Lindsay from Lindsay and Euphemia, was also a supporter of Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart at this time. Anyway, so she has some money trouble. Although I feel like, I don't know. Like maybe she could increase her like witchcraft activities to make some more money, put some curses on some people. I don't know.
Open up an Etsy shop, Margaret. What you doing? Like, it's a gig economy. Hustle.
You have all this wool. You're a witch. Like, just make some dream catchers or something.
Get felting. It's not hard. I mean, it might be hard. I don't know. I never felted. So
she's all these children. She can get them to do it.
Yeah.
So, okay. And then this is where it all kind of comes back to Mary Queen of Scots. So Margaret wrote to Mary Queen of Scots from her lodging in the Canongate of Edinburgh in March 1585. So this is shortly after the credit trouble situation. So she might have, she'd been away from the town because of the plague.
Yep.
Oh, do you know what this is? The Canongate of Edinburgh?
Canongate. So the Royal Mile, which stretches from Holyrood Palace up to Edinburgh Castle, has it's made up of lots of different streets, and the Canongate, which is where I think it must be to do with monks because of canon, is one of the parts of the Royal Mile nearest Holyrood. So it's near the bottom of the Royal Mile. So it would have been very adjacent to the Royal Palace at that point.
So she was staying somewhere fancy.
Yeah, pretty. Well, it's funny because yes and no. So at that point in time, Edinburgh was still... The new town hadn't been built, so Edinburgh was getting rapidly overpopulated, which is why things like plague were happening. So on the Canongate, what would happen was they'd build up rather than outwards because of the city walls. So you could live in very nice lodgings on the Canongate, but piled on top of you would be like up to like 10 or 11 floors of slum housing. So it was like the OG skyscrapers with people like throwing, shit out of the window and stuff like that. But on the bottom floor, you would be more stable. You would have bigger rooms. You might have some windows, that kind of thing. So the rich and the poor were quite mixed in together at this point. But within that, there were like different styles and sizes of dwelling house that may have been better or worse. But at its worst on the Royal Mile, you would have these rickety ass skyscrapers that were prone to collapse and filled with disease.
Well, I was just going to say, like, when you're talking 10 stories of slum housing in 16th century Edinburgh, like the stability of these structures would not be
terrible. Yeah, terrible. And one of the reasons they kept getting the plague was because sanitation was just like, just throw it out the window and hope for the best. And it's there's a lot of things about like how and why plague spread and how that connects to like beliefs about witches and things like that. But I would say the Canongate, because of its proximity to Holyrood, probably had some of the better lodgings, but it is also likely that there would have been, in fact, would the Canongate have been outside of the walls at that point? There's a point halfway up the Royal Mile where there's a pub called the World's End, and that's where the toll booth of entry to the city would have been. So it may have been slightly nicer than some of the bits further up the hill, but it certainly wouldn't have been palatial necessarily by any stretch.
And if she's used to living in castles in any way, this is not the vibe.
Absolutely. Not the vibe. It's just not the one.
No. So she was in litigation, and I love how much, well, having just done this Bess of Hardwick episode, I love a woman who is constantly suing people because at least we know what she was doing, like otherwise there's no records. So she was in litigation with her son. And I don't know if that means she and her son against somebody else or she's litigation against her son.
Yeah.
Unclear. This is from Wikitree, the genealogy website.
Amazing.
Anyway, so those people did this research. They knew that she did this. She mentioned that the Scottish court, quote, changes manners, meaning that at present, because this is still baby King James. He's like a young child.
Yeah, he's an infant king, isn't he? Yeah.
Yeah. So she's saying at present, the young king's advisors did not favor Mary, although she claims that the child king had great affection for her.
I mean, the kid probably doesn't know like who his mum bloody is at this point, but sure.
But this is what she's saying, because she's writing to Mary, Queen of Scots, saying like, your son is great. I wish that you and he could be together one day. And also, can I come to England and be your lady in waiting? And can I bring my daughter with me as well? Thank you. So like, she just needs a job, basically. So she's sucking up to Mary.
Yeah.
And Mary, Queen of Scots, at this point in England, is just like, yes, like she's obsessed with news about her son. She remembered her. Like, this was her lady in waiting from back in the day. She needed a new companion. So she's like, great, like, I'm all in favor of this. But guess what? It's not Mary's choice. She is in house arrest. Queen Elizabeth would not allow this to happen. And so this is maybe because Elizabeth just didn't allow anything good to happen to Mary Queen of Scots, but it's also allegedly because Elizabeth remembered the treason jewel, and she's like, that's that bitch who made the treason jewel.
Not today, bitch. Not today.
I have a long memory, and hell no.
Absolutely not.
So she was not able to go and tend to Mary Queen of Scots, which I think was, I'm guessing, she's living in Canongate. She's like suing somebody, potentially her son. Like, I think she just needed to get away from it all and a new job. Mm-hmm. But that didn't work. Anyway, Queen Elizabeth, Mary was upset at this decision. I mean, obviously, like, she wanted her to come and she wasn't able to. Queen Elizabeth thought that the request for companions was suspicious. But, everyone's suspicious. Anyway.
Well, yeah.
And that's kind of the last thing we know. So that was 1585. 2 years later, she died. She was around 59 years old. And she died in Auchterarder.
Yeah.
In Perthshire in Scotland.
Wow. What a life.
Can I just say, her children were, so Catherine, Jean, who is, I think we mentioned, she married Duncan Campbell of Glenorchy.
Mm-hmm.
Grisel.
Yep.
Grisel,
Crystal. They're all kind of variations on almost Crystal, but yeah, you get Crystals and Grizzles at this point, which is it hasn't endured. I have yet to meet a Grizzle in real life, but it's popular at this point.
I think that's the name of one of Cinderella's stepsisters in like the OG Disney Cinderella. It's Griselda,
yes,
I think.
Griselda, yeah.
I was just excited to see, like, again, like when you're having numerous children, you can't just call them all Jean. You have to come up with a new thing.
You got to keep it real. Keep it fresh.
Oh, wait, this just ties something else. So you remember when she was in credit trouble owing money from all of the wool to the tailor?
Yes.
Her money was all assigned to this guy, David Lindsay. David Lindsay is Grisel's husband.
Son-in-law. Oh, boom. What a use of power. Can you bail my mum out? She spent all her money on wool again. I love that.
So then she also has a daughter called Mary, wife of Francis Hay, the 9th Earl of Errol. And then her son, John, and this is the one who Okay, so she was in the courts either with or against. So he became the next Earl of Atholl. When he died in 1595, so like 10 years after her, basically, the earldom in default of male heirs reverted to the crown.
Oh, so none of them had sons?
Yeah.
Interesting. Oh, that's some strong female energy. Yeah.
The daughters that you couldn't burn.
Ooh. And how does our friend of the podcast link into all this?
Let me look up my message from Miranda, because she had said...
Miranda, that's right.
Let me look her up. And again, I love... And this is... What an interesting life, but also the fact that, like... So she died in 1587. When did... James was about like 20 years old-ish when she died.
Yeah, he would be almost exactly that, 21. And Mary, does she not get executed that year as well? Let me just double check.
I think it was around then, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's at Fotheringay just a couple of months later. Let me just double check that. Literally a month later, 8th of February, 1587. So yeah, that's incredible. She very close together.
So let me see. So Miranda says her 14 times great-grandmother was Janet Stewart.
That is incredible.
Her daughter, my 13 times great-grandmother, Margaret Fleming, was known as the greatest witch in Scots courts. Rumored to have been the real person behind the North Berwick witch trials, but never arrested or accused. And there's a story that says she was so well known as a witch that when her cousin, Mary Queen of Scots, gave birth, she was asked to be in the room to put the birthing pains onto a lady in waiting so Queen Mary would have a smoother labor and not die.
That is incredible. So I wonder which child that links her to.
Yeah, I don't know. Well, I hope Griselle, just because.
Yeah, I hope so too. I'm rooting for her. After everything David went through bailing his mum out of like fashion jail, I think that's, yeah, definitely. Incredible. And 4 daughters and 1 son. That's amazing.
Well, and that's why I like that it said like this, what was it? I think it was the jewel is conjectured to have been commissioned by the witches of Atholl, meaning her and her daughters. So I like that she and her daughters form sort of a coven.
A little coven. That's incredible.
So that's Margaret Fleming. And then she also has this weird sexy poem written about her.
Yeah, really kind of, salacious, degrading, but also quite entertaining poem that was being... And I didn't realize that after that, she hadn't shied away from it. I sort of had this image of her as like, oh no, I've been publicly... So you've been publicly shamed by a pamphlet, what next? But no, she kept doing it. She kept living her life. That's amazing. That makes me feel very warmly towards her.
Well, it's like, what am I going to do? I'm going to amass such quantities of wool
to make my little voodoo dolls of John Knox.
Yeah, sell those on
Love
Etsy.
That.
Yes.
Yeah, you'd need a lot for the beard, so that makes sense.
You would. That's also going to be discussed later today when we do our film discussion, David Tennant and the quantity of hair.
Incredible. Who's coming on to discuss? I can't wait to hear what y'all think.
Oh, it's going to be so Alison Epstein and Lana Wood Johnson. So we do on Patreon, usually we do these movie reviews. So this is going to be like a live
Wonderful
movie review, but there's definitely a lot to discuss. So you mentioned a few times you're working on a project, you're working on a book. What is that?
So my book is turning my thesis into a monograph. So it'll be all about the Bannatyne manuscript and the depictions of women within it. And I'm also going to be looking a little bit at the afterlife and the sort of colonial legacy. But I just finished a chapter for an invited collection called Life at the Margins that will be coming out next year, in which I wrote about James VI and First and queerness and his life and how historians have circumvented his sexuality and his kind of his queerness. And I think the other thing that I'm kind of arguing in it is that a lot of the mythology around James about him being like this good, stable king is because people are so tired and fed up after Mary and Darnley that they don't want him to repeat his parents' mistakes. So they're like, well...
I was not aware that anyone thought of him as a good and stable king.
In history, there is historical accounts in Scottish history academics of the 20th century. There's definitely a tendency to smooth him down into being like, he did a lot for culture. he was pretty stable after Mary, really. It could have been worse. His mum was a total piece of work and he seems normal. And I think that my theory is that is why a lot of the stuff about his sexuality is swept under the rug and is just like, well, we're not going to touch that. Like it was normal at that time to have favourites. He wasn't doing anything, untoward. But I think there's a bigger question in it about how we like flatten Scottish history and say like this really interesting guy who did some, a lot of the faults and problems that Scotland inflicted upon the world with their colonial agenda come directly from James and from Elizabeth. A lot of the problems we have with, witchcraft or things that happened with that kind of nervousness around female power in the 1600s come directly from him. And I think it's so unimaginative, I think, in previous historical research to say like, well, it doesn't really matter who his mum was. What we have to do is look at his reign and sort of think about X, Y, and Z. And I'm like, it matters hugely. Like at the heart of it, you've got this kid who didn't really have a mum because she was in prison, amongst other things, for murdering his dad. He has this really whack relationship with his godmother, who's also his mum's cousin, who's also responsible for his mum dying. And he has these really intense, passionate relationships with men in his court. I'm like, it's really interesting to me. So I kind of tried to reclaim that a little bit. So we'll see how it's received when it comes out. I don't know if it'll be any good or not. It's definitely out of my usual comfort zone. But I read a great book, actually. I was thinking of you. It's called Bad Gays, A Homosexual History.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it has a great chapter about James in it where it's like, essentially, he just loved twinks. That just made me laugh. I was like, I'm definitely quoting that. So it's about sort of unsmoothing the James narrative and starting to pick holes in it, like a tapestry almost, and saying, well, why aren't we talking more about that? Why are we so keen to make it just like, it happened, it's fine. It was better than his mum. It was a union. The union went, okay, let's keep going. And it's like, didn't really. Like, he was a whack job, especially if you're a woman.
Well, and like the continuing influence of the King James Bible on everything.
Literally everything that has happened that is terrible can be attributed back to the King James.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a vast exaggeration, but in terms of colonial agenda, like, yeah absolutely.
Yeah.
Like, so I don't know, my attention is wandering more towards like what happens after the Bannatyne now. And I'm sort of thinking like, well, yeah, what are the impacts of that? And this research into sort of the baronets of Nova Scotia has been really interesting in terms of like, who was literally holding it, who was doing what, and how was it related to other people. So there's a lot to kind of unpack with it. But I enjoyed writing about James and about queer theory and about, because the argument I was really making was people have always been averse to saying he was a gay man, he was a bisexual man, he was a heterosexual man who had affairs with men. And I'm like, why don't you just throw all of that out the window and just accept this label of like queerness and say, well, if we take a queer lens on James's court and his life, what do we learn from it? What do we learn about this person who was like the product of a very dysfunctional marriage, a very dysfunctional family setup, and see where that takes us next. So yeah, I don't know. I can send you if you like, because I'd be interested to know your thoughts.
I would love to read that. I would love to. I feel like many listeners would like to read that too. So if people want to keep up with what you're up to, including that, you're on, I don't know, like what's
I'm not on Twitter.
What social media is there?
I've evacuated the hell site, but I am now on Blue Sky, and I'm on as Eclepit, which is YCLEPIT. I have a website, lucyarhinnie.co.uk, and I also podcast. You can catch me on The Cast of Us, which is a zombie pop culture podcast, which is currently covering the Daryl Dixon show, and we're about to start a rewatch of all of The Walking Dead. So that's the kind of stuff that I do at the moment. But yeah, I'm coming into a point where I don't actually know what my next project/job is going to be. So I'm excited to see. But those are the places you can usually find me.
That's wonderful.
And, yeah.
I'm really happy to bring you into the fold of the whole vulgar history.
Oh, anytime. Situation. I've been a huge fan for so long.
Yeah.
And one of my greatest sorrows is that because of when the pandemic hit, we were deprived of cool hangs time in Saskatoon. I feel like there was this whole year where nobody could hang out. And then we, for various reasons, moved back to the UK. And I'm just like always sad that we didn't get that time to like chat in person and have a coffee and whatnot. So this is lovely.
I want to let the listeners know as well, when we finish this conversation, Lucy and I are going to do a special, just a little quick recording for Patreon because you used to work at Holyrood Palace.
I did, yes.
And
I did. That was my student job, yeah.
I can't imagine. Okay, well, I'm about to learn all about it. So that's going to be on Patreon. We're going to do an after show where I'm just going to ask you lots of questions. And one of my questions is going to be about the David Rizzio bloodstain on the floor. I don't know how much you're allowed to say, but that's going to be behind the paywall. So anyway, so the people on Patreon can hear that. We're going to record that next. But thank you so much, Lucy. This was such a treat.
Oh, it was so fun. Anytime. This was great. Thanks, Anne, for having me.
And so speaking of Mary, Queen of Scots, and all of it, so I have recorded the, I think I say in this, I was just about to do the YouTube live. That's all happened. It went great. We had such a good time. Myself, Alison Epstein, and Lana Wood Johnson were talking about the 2018 Mary, Queen of Scots film starring Saoirse Ronan. There was a fun time in the chat. Everybody had opinions. We were all angry, the chat and the three of us, about several omissions of characters. And like nobody in the movie says a Douglas, just like egregious things like that. But anyway, you can still, if you weren't able to watch the YouTube live, you can still find it. The recording is just up there on my YouTube page. Did you know I have a YouTube page? There's 2 things on it. Both of them are live stream recordings. So if you look up Vulgar History on YouTube and then click on live, you'll find the Mary Queen of Scots live. It is 3.5 hours long because we had a lot to say. And there's another live recording there too. If you just are like, I can't get enough of watching these 3 people's faces. We did a previous live stream about the Lady Jane Grey movie as well. And speaking of Alison Epstein, I wanted to just let you all know, if you didn't already know, that Alison's new book, Let the Dead Bury the Dead, has been published. You can get it from wherever you get your books from if you have a bookstore down the street. Like, side note, there is a bookstore down the street from me. It just opened, like, life goals. Anyway, go to your bookstore or go to your library, place a hold. If your library doesn't own Let the Dead Bury the Dead by Alison Epstein, there's always a form on every library website where you can suggest the library buy a book. So you can do that. Lots of ways to get this book. And once you have it and you start reading it, you can join the first ever Vulgar History book club. And so the way that this is working is that I'm putting up separate posts. There's just a couple up so far because the book was like just published. I respect that not everybody has read the whole thing yet, if you've even got your copy yet. So there's a post where it's like chapters 1 through 5 or something like that. So you can just jump in and talk just about those chapters. Don't worry about spoilers. You don't have to finish the book to take part. The next post is like, let's talk about chapters 6 through 9. So we can kind of like read along with each other and just talk about the plot twists as they happen. The main question that I have from the first part of the book is like, is this one character an ageless, immortal witch or not? And that's what a lot of my discussions are about. But anyway, I hope you are able to get a copy of Alison's book and you are enjoying it and take part in the book club. You can take part in it by going to vulgarhistory.com/book club, and everything is there. How it all works. It's all there. vulgarhistory.com/book club. Oh, I have another announcement actually. So last week when I was talking with Alison, speaking of, about Empress Elizabeth of Russia, we were talking about the Jeweled Tortoise Award, which was given to Alexei, Empress Elizabeth's longtime super secret sexy husband. And we were talking about Tunga, the buffalo herder, who was from the episode last year from the International season with Ronnie Didda. And if you will recall, Tunga the buffalo herder, aka the Golden Maknae, like Jungkook from BTS, he was amazing at everything he tried to do. And like Alexei was for Empress Elizabeth, he was really always there for her and just supported her in a great way. And so I threw it out to you, the Tits Up Brigade. Do you think that he should get an elevation? So he was already in the Lady Jane Seymour Memorial Award for Outstanding Supporting Performance, but we both felt like, I think he's in Jeweled Tortoise territory. And so I asked at an Instagram poll, 61% of people said, yes, he should go up. And if you're like 49% said no, it's like, no. Most people said not sure. So most people say yes, and that's what's in my heart. And so Tunga, the buffalo herder, no surname, don't know anything else about him, but we do know that he was a really good friend and partner to Ronnie Didda. So he has now joined the ranks of the Jeweled Tortoise Award category. And just some other things that I want to mention to you. For instance, I have a website, which is vulgarhistory.com, where if you go there, you can find there are transcripts of the most recent episodes. If you like to read podcasts, you can find those there. My partner, Aveline Malik from The Wordery, is working at those sort of like from front to back. So like the newest one's first, working backwards. So if there's an older-ish episode you're hoping for a transcript for, that will come in time. But anyway, you can find those all at vulgarhistory.com. There's also a form there where you can contact me if you have suggestions about people to talk about in the next season. You could also message me at vulgarhistorypod@gmail.com. And I was going to tell you, I'll tell you just one thing, which is that I do have a plan for next season. So I was looking back through my past episodes today for various reasons. And I was seeing like, okay, I often took 3 months off, 4 months off between seasons. Like before I found ways to keep having episodes, by doing interviews and things like that. And so there's going to be weekly episodes while I work on what I'm going to say is my most ambitious season to date. It's combining just everything that I've gotten, all the information I've gotten directly and indirectly from all of you, what you like in the podcast, what you'd like to see in the future. It's going to be sort of a combination of the Mary Queen of Scots season or the Lady Jane Grey season, where it's like a season where you talk about a bunch of people, and in so doing, you learn about one main person. So there'll be like a main person. But there's also going to be an international component to it. This is what I'm planning, and this is why it's taking a bit longer than sometimes to plan, because I really want to talk about this person who I won't reveal who it is, although I will say it's no one anyone has ever asked me to talk about. So yeah. So eliminate anyone that you are thinking of right now. It's someone no one's ever suggested to me. But it's a person whose life was at a really interesting time. A lot of interesting events happened to this person. And this person had interesting relatives and stuff. Anyway, but also at the world at the same time, there's lots of stuff going on. So what I'm looking at doing is talking about this person, the people who directly affected them, but then also what was going on in the world at the same time. So it's going to be like this combo, international, mixed with the Lady Jane Grey or the Mary Queen of Scots season. And what I'm hoping to be able to do is to just like do it from front to back. Like if I can plan enough ahead and get all the research done, we'll just do all the episodes all in a row without taking breaks in between, like I did during the Mary Queen of Scots season. There's also going to be hopefully a good mixture of like episodes where it's just me talking, and also episodes where I have guests, because some of these topics, like I really need to bring in an expert. So anyway, please note that is all in the works, and I'm excited. And as I have more that I can share with you about that, I shall share more about that with you. If you want to keep up with just what I'm doing and, other random polls I'm doing or whatever, like I'm basically at this point, with just the way social media is right now, I'm almost entirely only on Instagram at Vulgar History Pod, where I post an awful lot in the stories. I'm also in other places. I check for my mentions and see what people are saying to me on TikTok, where I'm at Vulgar History, on Instagram and Threads, I'm at Vulgar History Pod. I'm on like Blue Sky, like God knows. But like basically Instagram is where I mostly live. And that's where you can find me. I've also got, coming out soon, a new design of merch. So stay tuned for that. But also all the other merch, if you're like doing some holiday shopping or whatever, vulgarhistory.com/store. And or if you live not in the US, go to vulgarhistory.redbubble.com, because that's going to save you a little bit of money on shipping. We also have a Patreon, which is patreon.com/AnnFosterWriter. So this is where if you pledge at least $1 a month, you get early ad-free access to all episodes of Vulgar History Podcast. And if you pledge $5 or more a month, you get access to the early ad-free episodes, but also bonus episodes, including Vulgar Peace Theater. Most recently, I've just posted the episode this week, actually, where Alison, Lana, and I were talking about Chevalier, the movie about the Chevalier St. George. Not the Chevalier d'Eon, a person who I really wish there was a movie about, and I hope there will be soon. Anyway, also bonus episodes of things. I did at one point say that when I get 500 Patreon members, I will do a So This Asshole episode about John Knox. And as I speak, I'm at something like 460 members. So that's getting close. And I'm just like, it's going to happen at some point. If you want to contribute to that by joining the Patreon, which you can actually do now. You can join the Patreon for free as well, because that's where the book club is hosted too, for free. It's just when you join the Patreon for free, there's a chat you can do there for where we talk about all the episodes, and you can join the book club. So if you want to take part in it, but you're not in a place where you're able to like donate money, totally fine. And I just want to say, like, this podcast is always going to be free. Like, this is the main thing that's happening, is this podcast. And I'm happy to be doing this with all of you. And I think that's nearly everything I want to say. I think that's everything I want to say. So thank you so much for listening. And there'll be another new episode next week. And until then, keep your pants on and your tits out and have a happy Halloween. Vulgar History is hosted, written, and researched by Anne Foster and edited by Christina Lumagi.
Welcome to the small town of Chinook, where faith runs deep and secrets run deeper. In this new thriller, religion and crime collide when a gruesome murder rocks the isolated Montana community. Everyone is quick to point their fingers at a drug-addicted teenager, but local deputy Ruth Vogel isn't convinced. She suspects connections to a powerful religious group. Enter federal agent V.B. Laureau, who has been investigating a local church for possible criminal activity. The pair form an unlikely partnership to catch the killer, unearthing secrets that leave Ruth torn between her duty to the law, her religious convictions, and her very own family. But something more sinister than murder is afoot, and someone is watching Ruth. Chinook, starring Kelly Marie Tran and Sanaa Lathan. Listen to Chinook wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, I'm Jennifer, a co-founder of the Go Kid Go network. At Go Kid Go, putting kids first is at the heart of every show that we produce. That's why we're so excited to introduce a brand new show to our network called The Search for the Silver Lining, a fantasy adventure series about a spirited young girl named Isla who time travels to the mythical land of Camelot. During her journey, Isla meets new friends, including King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, and learns valuable life lessons with every quest, sword fight, and dragon ride. Positive and uplifting stories remind us all about the importance of kindness, friendship, honesty, and positivity. Join me and an all-star cast of actors including Liam Neeson, Emily Blunt, Kristen Bell, Chris Hemsworth, among many others, in welcoming the Search for the Silver Lining podcast to the Go Kid Go network by listening today. Look for the Search for the Silver Lining on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts.